Welcome to episode 4 of the podcast Mine Planning Matters. This one is a continuation on from episode 3 in terms of it's all about why stochastic scheduling. And it's the second part of my keynote presentation to the Deswick Users Conference, which was all about why stochastic scheduling. And so this is the second part. Before you watch this, you should really go back to episode 3 and start at the beginning of my keynote conference instead of coming partway through, because otherwise it'll be difficult to pick up. So if this is the first time you're watching it, go back to episode 3 first.
And the interesting thing about variability and risk is that we choose to some extent how much variability or risk that we build into our operations. And the mining industry actually chooses to operate in a fairly risked basis. And so a good example is maintenance. So in other industries, in non-mining industries, best practice, they will tend to set a best practice for unplanned or breakdown maintenance of somewhere around about 20% of your total maintenance time. So about 80% or so is preventative and 20% is breakdown. And that's sort of a target in other industries. Now I got some figures for about 50 digging units and so on that I could find, drag lines and shovels and those sorts of things. And the average across those numbers was breakdown was about 50% and planned was about 50%. So where best practice in other industries might be 20% breakdown maintenance, the mining industry tends to operate at about 50% or so on instead. Now, obviously there's some logic behind that, right? Expensive costs of parts and so on. And so we tend to operate to failure rather than changing out ahead and so on. What we don't necessarily think about is that the level of variability that introduces into our mine plans, because we get all these unplanned breakdowns all the time. And not only do we get them regularly, but we don't know how long they're going to last. Now we could compare that, for example, with the airline industry, who tends to sit at the other end of the spectrum. And so, in the airline industry, right, if you're having a lot of breakdown maintenance and those sorts of things, then best case scenario, you've got a whole lot of passengers sitting in a terminal who get really cranky. The worst case scenario, your planes are falling out of the sky. And so that's not really a very good business model in the scheme of things. And so, from a planning perspective, airlines have to operate at a significantly different space in terms of being able to run to plan versus mines. If our equipment breaks down and so on, it's like, so be it, sort of, for example, right? A plane breaking down is a totally different thing. And so therefore the airline industry tends to operate with breakdown maintenance of about 5 to 10% of the total maintenance time versus our 50% sort of in the mining industry. Now, I'm not necessarily saying which is right or which is wrong, and that the mining industry should choose to change and follow the airline industry or something, because that obviously comes at an extreme cost. What I am actually just trying to point out is the difference in risk between the two, and the difference in following plan in the airline industry versus following plan in the mining industry. Let me give you another example, and that is blasting. So we could choose from a blasting perspective to just put heaps of powder in the ground, blast the shit out of every blast, and everything would dig like cream, right? That would be a low risk thing to do from the point of view of being able to follow plan. But we don't do that because that's a fairly cost prohibitive process. And so again, we make a financial trade-off decision. And instead, we put the minimum amount of explosives in the ground that we think is going to get us the product that we want, which is a certain diggability or a certain cast or whatever it is, right? But in the drill and blast space, same as every other space in mining, we get lots of variability. Drill holes, were the holes drilled in the right location? Were they the right depth? Do we put the right stemming in? How much water was in the hole, sort of, and so on. And so there's all these variabilities that come into play in drill and blast. And so what happens is that every now and then it goes wrong. And you get a blast that doesn't quite go to plan. And I must admit, when I watched this, I couldn't help but find myself laughing, and how glad I was that I wasn't the drill and blast engineer. And it's a long time since I've seen sort of that much fly rock. And the interesting thing about this was that I spoke to one of the guys involved. This is actually South Africa. And this was none of those issues that I mentioned about drill hole location and stemming or any of those sorts of things. This was purely a blasting contractor who was contracted to run at a certain powder factor, and they had to run at that powder factor. And so that's what they did. They produced a blast at that powder factor, in the scheme of things. Now, you know, I like blasts that go wrong, and so we can't stop at one, right? We should at least do one more. In fact, I could have done probably about 10 of these. And it reminds me of when I was a drill and blast engineer at Blair Athol many, many years ago. And we had the biggest blast in Blair Athol's history while I was a drill and blast engineer there. And it was a really big deal in town. And there was bus loads of people that came out, and everyone on site was all up the lookout to watch the blast that was the biggest in Blair Athol's history. And of course, a boring blast is a good blast in the scheme of things. And so, you know, I was walking around up on the lookout, just trying to downplay everyone's expectations about, this is going to be boring in the scheme of things, right? But everyone had high hopes. And the good thing was, for me, I was the only one who probably came away that day excited at the result. Everyone else was fairly much what an anticlimax it was, and why did I bother coming out from town? So again, I've just given two examples there in terms of maintenance and drill and blast of where we choose to introduce risk into our operations. And the thing that I find fascinating, right, is that we get really hung up on following the plan. And we want to hold people accountable for following the plan. And we want to put measures, compliance to plan measures in place and so on. And yet we choose to introduce risk into our operations that almost to some extent makes it impossible for people to follow the plan. But it doesn't matter. We've got KPIs in place. The mining industry loves KPIs.
Thanks for listening to Mine Planning Matters and my thoughts on mine planning. This podcast is for the benefit of the mining industry, and that's you. So I'd love to hear from you through the comments section, and please feel free to let me know any topics you'd like discussed in future episodes. You'll find much more content at our Insignia Mining website, and if you find any of our content valuable, please let your mining colleagues know so they can benefit as well.